In the scorching heat of the Arizona Territory in 1882, where the line between civilization and wilderness was drawn in blood and courage, one moment could change a man's entire destiny. When cultures collided on the harsh frontier, love didn't follow the rules of society, it followed the laws of the heart. This is the true story of how a simple act of kindness transformed into an unexpected bond that would challenge everything two people believed about their worlds, their enemies, and themselves. Sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a choice, but with a claim that changes everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Sonoran Desert as Thomas McKenna guided his horse through the narrow canyon pass. The year was 1882, and the Arizona Territory remained a land where survival depended more on instinct than law. Thomas, a weathered cowboy of 32 years, had spent the better part of a decade moving cattle across these unforgiving lands. His sun-darkened skin and calloused hands told the story of countless days under the blazing desert sun, while his steady blue eyes held the wisdom of a man who had learned to read the land like scripture. The cattle drive had been particularly challenging that spring. Late rains had made the rivers unpredictable, and reports of Apache raids had kept everyone on edge. Thomas rode point for a herd of nearly 800 head, moving them from the grazing lands near Tucson toward the railroad depot in Lordsburg, New Mexico. It was dangerous work, made more perilous by the ongoing conflicts between settlers and the Apache tribes who had called this land home for generations. As Thomas crested a small ridge, he pulled his horse to a stop and reached for the field glasses hanging from his saddle horn. The view ahead showed the trail winding through a series of red rock formations, perfect country for an ambush. He had learned long ago that caution kept a man breathing in Apache country. The morning air was still cool, but he could already feel the promise of another scorching day building on the horizon. What caught his attention wasn't movement among the rocks, but rather the absence of it. No birds sang. No small animals scurried through the brush. Even his horse, a reliable bay mare named Duchess, seemed nervous, her ears flicking back and forth as she tested the wind. Thomas had learned to trust his horse's instincts almost as much as his own. He was about to signal the all clear to the cowboys behind him when he spotted something that made his blood run cold. Smoke, thin and grey, rising from a depression about a mile ahead. In this country, smoke usually meant one of two things: travelers making coffee or the aftermath of trouble. Given the eerie silence that had settled over the landscape, Thomas suspected it wasn't coffee. Against his better judgment, but driven by the cowboy code that demanded a man investigate when other lives might be at stake, Thomas guided Duchess toward the source of the smoke. He left the main trail and picked his way carefully through the scattered boulders and desert scrub, his rifle ready across his saddle. As he drew closer, the smell hit him first. Not just wood smoke, but something else. Something that spoke of violence and death. Thomas had been in the territory long enough to recognize the aftermath of an Indian raid. When he finally reached the edge of the depression, what he saw confirmed his worst fears. Below him lay the remains of what had been a small wagon train. 3 wagons, their canvas tops burned away, sat like broken bones against the desert floor. Bodies lay scattered around the camp, and from his position above, Thomas could count at least 6 people who would never see another sunrise. The attack had probably happened the day before, given the condition of the scene below. Thomas was preparing to ride back and warn the cattle drive to take another route when movement caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be a scavenging animal, but as he watched more carefully, he realized it was human. Someone had survived the massacre. He guided Duchess down the steep slope, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The Apaches who had done this were likely long gone, but Thomas had survived this long by never taking unnecessary chances. As he approached the camp, he could see that the survivor was a woman kneeling beside one of the bodies. She looked up as he approached, and Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. She was Apache, probably in her mid-20s, with the strong features and dark eyes characteristic of her people. Her long black hair was partially braided with small shells and beads, and she wore a traditional dress of soft doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork. But what struck Thomas most was not her appearance, but the complete lack of fear in her eyes as she watched him approach. Most people, Indian or white, would have shown some reaction to a stranger appearing in such circumstances. This woman simply watched him, with a calm intelligence that unnerved him more than outright hostility would have. She said something in Apache, her voice melodious despite the grim setting. Thomas dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible and his rifle pointed away from her. Ma'am, he said, touching the brim of his hat in the universal gesture of respect. I don't speak Apache, but I can see you've had trouble here. The woman studied him for a long moment, then spoke in accented but clear English. You are cowboy, yes? You drive cattle? Her command of English surprised him, but then Thomas remembered that many Apache had learned the language through various contacts with whites, not all of them hostile. Yes, ma'am. Name's Thomas McKenna. I've got a herd about 2 miles back that way. She stood gracefully, and Thomas was struck by her bearing. Despite being in the middle of a massacre scene, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength. My name is Ayana. It means eternal blossom in your language. She gestured toward the bodies around them. These people, they helped me when my own people cast me out. Now they are dead because they showed kindness to Apache woman. Thomas looked around the camp again, this time noticing details he had missed before. The wagons had been carrying supplies, not the usual household goods of settlers. There were medical supplies, food, and what looked like trade goods. These folks were traders. Ayana nodded. They trade with Apache, with Mexican, with anyone who'd deal fair. The old man, Samuel, he found me 3 days ago. I am... She paused, searching for the right words. I am between worlds. My people say I bring bad medicine because I speak for peace with white man. As people say Apache cannot be trusted, so I have no people. The story was becoming clearer to Thomas. Ayana had been cast out by her own tribe, probably for advocating peaceful coexistence with the whites. The traders had taken her in, and now they were all dead, likely killed by a war party that saw their kindness to her as betrayal. What happened here? Thomas asked, though he was fairly certain he knew the answer. War party come yesterday morning. They see me with white people, they think I am traitor. Samuel tried to protect me. Say I am good woman who want peace. But war chief, he is young man who listens only to anger. He kill them all. Ayana's voice remained steady, but Thomas could see the pain in her eyes. They leave me alive to carry shame. They say I must watch what comes to those who help Apache women, who forget their place. Thomas felt a surge of anger at the senseless killing, but he also recognized the complicated politics at play. The Apache had been fighting for their land and way of life for decades. Young warriors, frustrated by years of conflict and loss, often saw any cooperation with whites as betrayal. At the same time, people like Samuel, who tried to build bridges between the communities, paid a terrible price for their efforts. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am, Thomas said quietly. These look like good people. Ayana walked over to where an elderly man lay near the largest wagon. Samuel, he say something to me before he die. He say if anything happen, I should find cowboy named McKenna who drive cattle through here. He say this McKenna is good man who keep his word. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Samuel knew my name? He say you help him 2 summers ago when his wagon break down near Tucson. You fix wheel and take no payment. He never forget kindness. Ayana turned to face Thomas directly. He say, if I ever need help, I should find Thomas McKenna and tell him Samuel's last wish. Thomas remembered the incident clearly now. He had indeed helped an old trader named Samuel repair his wagon, and the man had tried repeatedly to pay him. Thomas had refused, saying that helping folks in trouble was just what people did out here. Now, apparently that simple act of kindness had created an obligation he had never expected. What did Samuel ask of me? Thomas said, though part of him already feared the answer. Ayana walked closer, close enough that Thomas could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. He say to tell you that Ayana is good woman caught between 2 worlds that will not have her. He asked that you take her somewhere safe, away from this place where her presence brings death to those who show kindness. Thomas looked around the camp again, his mind racing. Taking an Apache woman with him would create enormous complications. His cattle drive crew would not understand. The army patrols they might encounter would be suspicious. And yet, leaving her here alone in the desert would be a death sentence just as surely as if he shot her himself. There's more, Ayana said quietly. Samuel, he tell me about Apache custom. He say among my people, when woman is cast out and has no protection, she can claim protection from warrior by declaring him her husband. This give her status, give her safety. Thomas felt his world shift beneath him like sand in a windstorm. Ma'am, I appreciate the difficult position you're in, but Ayana held up her hand to stop him. I do not ask this thing lightly, Thomas McKenna. But War Party will return. They will track me, and they will kill anyone who helps me unless that person has legitimate claim to protect me. In Apache law, husband has absolute right to protect wife. Even war chief must respect this. The logic was ironclad, and Thomas recognized it immediately. He had spent enough time in Apache country to know something of their customs. A husband's protection of his wife was considered sacred beyond the reach of tribal politics or war party justice. But the implications of what Ayana was suggesting staggered him. You're talking about marriage, he said slowly. Not marriage as white man knows, Ayana clarified. Apache marriage is different, is agreement, is protection, is partnership, can be ended by either person when circumstances change. But while it exists, it is sacred bond that even enemies must respect. Thomas walked over to his horse, ostensibly to check his gear, but really to give himself time to think. The morning sun was climbing higher, and he knew his crew would be wondering what had happened to him. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it soon. When he turned back to Ayana, she was watching him with that same calm intelligence. She wasn't pleading or trying to manipulate him. She was simply presenting the facts and waiting for his answer. If I agree to this, Thomas said carefully, what exactly does that mean? What would be expected of me? You provide protection and safe passage. I provide knowledge of land, of Apache ways, of dangers you might not see coming. We help each other survive until we reach place where I can make new life safely. Ayana paused. And you fulfill promise to dying man who trusted you. Thomas thought about Samuel's kindness to Ayana, and about the price he and his companions had paid for that kindness. He thought about the oath he had sworn years ago to never leave anyone in need if he had the power to help, and he thought about the strange woman standing before him, caught between two worlds that had both rejected her. Ayana, he said finally, I want you to understand something. I'm not looking for a wife, Apache or otherwise. I'm a cattleman who moves from place to place, and I've got responsibilities to my crew and my employers that I can't just abandon. I understand, she said simply. Thomas took a deep breath. But I also understand what it means to be caught between worlds. And I reckon Samuel was right about you being a good woman trying to do right in a situation where there might not be any right answers. He walked back over to where she stood, noting again how she carried herself with quiet dignity despite everything that had happened. If this Apache marriage you're talking about will keep you safe and honor Samuel's last wish, then I'm willing to enter into it. But I want your word that when we reach a safe place where you can start over, we'll end this arrangement so you can build the life you want. For the first time since he had found her, Ayana smiled. It transformed her entire face, revealing a warmth and intelligence that took Thomas's breath away. You have my word, Thomas McKenna, and you have my gratitude. She walked over to where several small personal items lay scattered around Samuel's body. She selected a leather cord strung with small shells and turquoise beads, then returned to where Thomas stood. Apache marriage ceremony is simple, she explained. We speak promises to each other before witnesses. Since there are no living witnesses here, we make promises to spirits of these good people who died trying to protect me. She held out the cord to Thomas. You take this, and I take something of yours. We wear them as sign of our bond. Thomas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small silver cross on a thin chain, a gift from his mother many years before. He had worn it through cattle drives, bar fights, and Indian raids. Now, in this place of death and new beginnings, he was offering it to an Apache woman as a symbol of protection and partnership. They exchanged the item silently, each understanding the weight of what they were doing. Then Ayana began to speak in Apache, her voice carrying clearly across the silent camp. Though Thomas couldn't understand the words, he could hear the solemnity and reverence in her tone. When she finished, she looked at Thomas expectantly. Now you speak your promise. Thomas cleared his throat, feeling more nervous than he had before any gunfight. I, Thomas McKenna, take you, Ayana, under my protection. I promise to keep you safe and help you find a place where you can build a new life. I promise to honor the trust that Samuel placed in me and to respect the customs of your people in this arrangement. As the words left his mouth, Thomas felt something shift inside him. It wasn't love. They barely knew each other, but it was a sense of responsibility and partnership that he had never experienced before. Ayana nodded solemnly. It is done. In eyes of Apache law, you are now my husband, and I am your wife. The bond will protect us both. Thomas looked around the camp one more time, then back at Ayana. We need to bury these people properly and then get out of here. That war party might come back, and I've got a cattle drive to get back to. Your men will not understand, Ayana said quietly. Then I'll make them understand, Thomas replied. You're under my protection now, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally. As they began the grim work of preparing the bodies for burial, Thomas found himself stealing glances at the woman who had just claimed him as her husband. He had woken up that morning as a simple cattleman with a straightforward job to do. Now he was bound by Apache law to a woman who represented everything complicated and dangerous about life on the frontier. But as he watched Ayana work with quiet efficiency and obvious respect for the dead, Thomas began to think that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected turn of events might not be the disaster he had first imagined. There was something about this woman, her strength, her dignity, a refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have crushed most people, that spoke to something deep in his cowboy heart. The sun climbed higher as they worked, and somewhere in the distance Thomas could hear the faint lowing of cattle and the shouts of his crew. His old life was calling to him, but beside him worked a woman who represented something entirely new and uncertain. As Ayana had said, it was done. Thomas McKenna was now a married man, bound by laws he barely understood to a woman he had just met. But as they finished their work and prepared to ride toward whatever complications awaited them, Thomas found himself looking forward to discovering what came next in this most unexpected of partnerships. The ride back to the cattle drive gave Thomas time to think about how he was going to explain his new circumstances to his crew. Cowboys were practical men who understood danger, loyalty, and keeping your word, but they were also products of their time, raised on stories of Apache raids and frontier violence. Bringing an Apache woman into camp would test every relationship he had built during his years on the trail. Ayana rode Samuel's horse, a sturdy sorrel gelding that had survived the attack. She sat the saddle with the natural grace of someone born to horseback, and Thomas noticed that she constantly scanned their surroundings with the alertness of a person accustomed to danger. She rode in silence, seemingly lost in her own thoughts, but Thomas sensed that she was as aware of their precarious situation as he was. As they crested the rise that overlooked the camp, Thomas could see the familiar sight of the cattle spread across the valley floor, grazing contentedly while the cowboys maintained their positions around the perimeter. It was a scene he had witnessed hundreds of times before, but today it felt different. Today he was returning with complications that would change everything. Stay close to me when we ride in, Thomas told Ayana. Let me do the talking until we can sort this out. She nodded without speaking, but he caught the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested she was preparing for trouble. Thomas couldn't blame her. If the situation were reversed, if she were bringing him into an Apache camp as her husband, he would be more than a little nervous about the reception he might receive. The first person to spot them was Jake Morrison, the young cowboy Thomas had assigned to watch the back trail. Jake's cheerful wave changed to a confused stare as he got a better look at Thomas's companion, and Thomas could practically see the questions forming in the young man's mind. "Boss!" Jake called out as they approached. "Everything all right? We were starting to worry when you didn't signal back." "Everything's fine, Jake," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a respected trail boss. "Pass the word that I want all hands gathered around the chuck wagon in 10 minutes. We need to have a talk." Jake nodded and spurred his horse toward the camp, but Thomas could see him glancing back over his shoulder with obvious curiosity. Word would spread quickly now, and Thomas knew he had only a few minutes to figure out exactly what he was going to say to his men. The cattle drive crew consisted of 8 men, not counting Thomas himself. They were good men, experienced and loyal, but they had signed on to drive cattle, not to escort an Apache woman across hostile territory. Thomas had to find a way to explain the situation that would maintain their respect and their willingness to follow his orders. Cookie Williams, the camp cook and unofficial philosopher of the outfit, was waiting by his wagon when Thomas and Ayana rode up. Cookie was a grizzled veteran of dozens of cattle drives who had seen enough of frontier life to be surprised by very little. His weathered face gave away nothing as he watched Thomas dismount and help Ayana down from her horse. "Cookie," Thomas said, "I want you to meet Ayana. She'll be traveling with us for a while." Cookie touched his hat brim politely. "Ma'am." His voice was neutral, but Thomas could see the questions in his eyes. The other cowboys began gathering around the chuck wagon, their faces showing varying degrees of curiosity, concern, and suspicion. Thomas recognized the look. These men trusted his judgment, but they needed an explanation that made sense in their world. "Boys," Thomas began, "I know you're wondering about our new companion, so I'm going to tell you the straight truth. Ayana here is Apache, and according to the customs of her people, she's my wife." The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear the cattle lowing in the distance, and the wind rustling through the desert grass. Finally, young Jake Morrison found his voice. "Boss, are you saying you got married to an Apache woman?" Thomas nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And before any of you start getting ideas about what that means, let me explain the circumstances." He told them about finding the massacre site, about Samuel's dying wish, and about the Apache customs that had made the marriage necessary for Ayana's protection. He spoke honestly about the complications this would create, but also about the obligations he felt to honor Samuel's trust and to protect a woman who had been caught between two worlds through no fault of her own. When he finished, the silence stretched out again. His men had followed Thomas McKenna for years because they trusted his judgment and respected his character. Now that trust was being tested in a way none of them had anticipated. It was Cookie who spoke first. "Well, boss, can't say this is the most conventional arrangement I've seen on a cattle drive, but I reckon every man's got to follow his conscience. If you say this lady needs protecting, then I guess we'll just have to figure out how to make it work." One by one, the other cowboys nodded their agreement. They might not understand all the complexities of Apache law or frontier politics, but they understood loyalty to their trail boss and respect for a woman in distress. Buck Henderson, the oldest hand on the crew, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said to Ayana, "I want you to know that any friend of Tom McKenna's is welcome in this outfit. We'll do our best to see you get wherever you're going safely." Ayana's composure, which had remained steady through everything, finally showed signs of cracking. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she looked around at the circle of weathered faces. "You are good men," she said simply. "I will not bring trouble to you if I can help it." Thomas felt a surge of pride in his crew. These men might be rough around the edges, but they had hearts as big as the territory they crossed. "All right then," he said. "We've got cattle to move and a schedule to keep. Ayana will ride with me, and I want everyone to treat her with the respect due to a lady. Any questions?" There were no questions, at least not spoken aloud, and the crew dispersed to their duties with the practiced efficiency that marked a good outfit. But Thomas knew that the real test would come when they encountered other people on the trail. His own men he could handle, but they would inevitably meet army patrols, other cattle drives, and settlers who might not be so understanding. As they resumed their journey north toward New Mexico, Thomas found himself riding beside Ayana in comfortable silence. She seemed to understand that he needed time to think about how this arrangement would work practically, and she occupied herself with studying the landscape and the cattle with the keen attention of someone accustomed to reading sign and watching for danger. It was during their noon rest that Thomas began to appreciate the practical advantages of having Ayana with them. While the cowboys were eating Cookie's stew and complaining about the heat, she quietly approached Thomas with information that made him realize how much he had been missing. "Your cattle, they are nervous about something," she said. "See how they bunch together on south side of herd? And see how birds fly in circles but do not land? There are riders following us." Thomas looked where she indicated and saw that she was right. The cattle were exhibiting the subtle signs of unease that he had attributed to the heat and flies, but which Ayana had correctly identified as a response to some external threat. He called Jake Morrison over and handed him the field glasses. "Ride back about a mile and see what you can spot," Thomas instructed. "But be careful about it. If someone's tracking us, I want to know who and how many." Jake returned an hour later with confirmation of Ayana's observation. "There's a dust cloud about 3 miles back, boss. Looks like maybe a dozen riders, moving parallel to our trail but staying out of sight." Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his stomach that came with the prospect of trouble. "Could be anything," he said. "Might be another cattle drive, might be army patrol, might be something we don't want to meet." "It is war party," Ayana said quietly. "Same one that killed Samuel's people. They follow to see what I do with new husband." The statement hit the camp like a lightning bolt. Every man present understood the implications immediately. Apache war parties didn't follow cattle drives out of curiosity. They were either planning an attack or testing the resolve of their quarry. How can you be so sure? Thomas asked. Ayana pointed to a distant ridge where a tiny figure appeared for just a moment before disappearing behind the rocks. See, Scout, he show himself just long enough to let me know they are there. This is message. They want me to know they watch. They wait to see if I am truly protected by white husband or if I am still vulnerable. Thomas called Buck Henderson and 2 other experienced hands over for a quick conference. If they're testing us, then we need to show them we're not easy prey. But I don't want to provoke a fight if we can avoid it. What does Apache Customs say about this situation? Buck asked Ayana directly. If you're married to Tom here, what are they allowed to do? If marriage is real, if husband truly protects wife, then war party must respect this, Ayana replied. But if they think marriage is pretense, if they think white man will abandon Apache woman when danger comes, then they will take me back for punishment. The logic was clear, and Thomas realized that the next few hours would determine not just Ayana's fate, but the safety of his entire crew. If the Apache war party decided that his protection of Ayana was genuine, they would likely withdraw and leave the cattle drive alone. But if they sensed weakness or deception, the consequences could be catastrophic. What would convince them? Thomas asked. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her words carefully. Apache husband would ride out to meet war party. He would speak to war chief, show that he is strong man who protects his wife by choice, not by force or trickery. The suggestion sent a chill through the assembled cowboys. Riding out to meet an Apache war party was not the kind of activity that promoted longevity on the frontier. That's asking a lot, boss, Buck said quietly. These boys have families to think about. Thomas understood Buck's concern, but he also understood that running from the situation would only make it worse. If the war party wanted to test his commitment to protecting Ayana, then hiding behind his cattle and his crew would prove exactly the opposite of what needed to be proven. I'll ride out alone, Thomas decided. The rest of you stay with the herd and be ready for trouble. If this goes bad, you get these cattle to Lordsburg and don't look back. No, Ayana said firmly. Apache wife rides with husband when he faces war party. This is how they know marriage is real, is partnership, not just white man's charity. Thomas looked into her dark eyes and saw, not fear, but determination. This woman who had already lost everything was willing to ride into danger beside him to protect the men who had shown her kindness. It was a display of courage that humbled him. All right then, Thomas said. We'll ride out together, but we do this smart. We meet them halfway, show respect but not fear, and we make it clear that Ayana is under my protection permanently. As they prepared for the confrontation, Thomas found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in just one day. Yesterday he had been a simple cattleman with straightforward problems. Today he was preparing to face an Apache war party alongside a woman he barely knew, but to whom he was bound by laws older than any court in the territory. Cookie Williams approached as Thomas was checking his rifle and pistol. Tom, the old cook said quietly, I'd been on a lot of drives with you, and I've seen you make some hard decisions. This might be the hardest yet. I know, Cookie, but sometimes a man's got to do what's right, even when it's not smart. Cookie nodded. Just want you to know, the boys and me, we're with you whatever happens. That girl's got sand, and any woman who can face down an Apache war party deserves our respect. Thomas felt a surge of affection for these men who had chosen to stand with him despite the risks. I'm counting on you to get everyone home safe if this goes sideways. We'll do our part, Cookie promised. You just make sure you come back. We've got cattle to deliver. As Thomas and Ayana rode out from the camp toward the distant ridge where the Apache scouts had been spotted, Thomas reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. He had always prided himself on being a practical man who avoided unnecessary complications. Now he was riding toward what could be his death, alongside a woman who had claimed him as her husband based on customs he barely understood. But as they rode side by side across the sun-baked desert, Thomas found himself oddly at peace with the situation. There was something about Ayana's quiet strength and dignity that made him want to be worthy of her trust. Whether their marriage was real or simply a legal fiction designed to protect her, Thomas found himself determined to honor the commitment he had made. The ride to the meeting place took nearly an hour, and with each mile Thomas could see more evidence of the war party's presence. Dust clouds, distant figures moving among the rocks, and the nervous behavior of his horse all confirmed that they were heading into a situation that could explode into violence at any moment. When they finally reached the designated meeting ground, a natural amphitheater formed by red rock walls. The war party was waiting for them. Thomas counted 12 warriors, all mounted and armed, arranged in a semicircle facing the spot where he and Ayana had stopped their horses. The war chief rode forward, a young man whose face bore the ritual scars of a seasoned fighter. He spoke in Apache to Ayana, his tone formal but challenging. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the underlying threat in the man's voice. Ayana responded in the same language, her voice steady and clear. Thomas could see that she was explaining the situation, making the case for her marriage to him and his right to protect her. The conversation went back and forth for several minutes, with other warriors occasionally adding comments. Finally, Ayana turned to Thomas. War Chief says white men cannot truly understand Apache ways. He says white men take Apache women for slaves or for pleasure, but they do not take them as true wives. He wants proof that you understand what it means to be Apache husband. Thomas dismounted and walked forward until he was standing directly in front of the war chief's horse. He looked up at the young Apache leader and spoke clearly. I don't speak your language, but I hope you understand mine. This woman came to me asking for protection according to your laws. I gave my word to protect her, and I keep my word. She is my wife according to Apache custom, and I will defend her against anyone who tries to harm her. The war chief said something to Ayana, who translated. He says words are easy. He wants to know if white husband will fight Apache warriors to protect Apache wife. The challenge was unmistakable, and Thomas realized that this moment would determine everything that followed. He thought about his crew waiting back at the camp, about the cattle he was responsible for, and about the woman who had trusted him with her life. Tell him, Thomas said quietly, that if he wants to test my commitment to my wife, I'm ready to give him that test. But also tell him that fighting will solve nothing. If he kills me, Ayana will be alone again. If I kill him, his warriors will never accept her marriage to me. Ask him what he really wants. Ayana translated, and for a long moment the war chief studied Thomas with the calculating gaze of a man weighing risks and benefits. Finally he spoke again, his tone slightly different. He says you speak like man who thinks before he acts. This is good thing in husband. He says he will accept marriage if you prove understanding of Apache ways by sharing food and smoke with war party. This is ancient custom that shows respect. Thomas nodded. The offer was more than he had dared hope for. Sharing food and smoke was a universal gesture of peace among Plains Indians, a ritual that created temporary bonds even between enemies. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Thomas had experienced. Sitting in a circle with 12 Apache warriors who had been prepared to kill him an hour before, sharing jerky and water and passing a ceremonial pipe, he found himself thinking about the strange paths that led men to understanding. As the sun began to set and the ceremony concluded, the war chief stood and spoke directly to Thomas in broken English. "You're good man. Take care of woman. She choose well." With that simple statement, the crisis passed. The war party mounted their horses and rode away into the gathering dusk, leaving Thomas and Ayana alone in the amphitheater. They had passed the test, but Thomas knew it was only the first of many challenges they would face as they continued their journey across the frontier. As they rode back toward the cattle drive, Ayana spoke for the first time since the ceremony had ended. "You surprised them," she said, "and you surprised me. Most white men would have tried to fight or run away. You chose understanding." Thomas considered her words. I reckon there's been enough fighting between our people. Maybe it's time to try something different." When they reached the camp, they found the crew waiting anxiously for their return. The relief on the men's faces was obvious, and Thomas realized how much they had risked by supporting his decision to honor Samuel's dying wish. As they settled in for the night around Cookie's campfire, Thomas found himself looking at Ayana with new eyes. The events of the day had transformed their relationship from a legal arrangement into something deeper. They had faced danger together, stood up to a war party together, and earned each other's respect in the process. The trail ahead would bring new challenges, but Thomas was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected marriage might turn out to be one of the best decisions he had ever made. The weeks following their encounter with the Apache war party brought a transformation in the dynamics of the cattle drive that Thomas could never have anticipated. What had begun as a practical arrangement for Ayana's protection evolved into something far more complex and meaningful. As they traveled the long miles toward Lordsburg, Ayana proved to be an invaluable addition to the crew in ways that went far beyond her knowledge of Apache customs. Her understanding of the land was encyclopedic. She could predict weather changes hours before they became visible, identify water sources from subtle changes in vegetation, and spot signs of danger that even experienced cowboys missed. More than once, her warnings about flash flood conditions or quicksand saved both cattle and men from disaster. But it was her gradual integration into the social fabric of the outfit that surprised Thomas most. The cowboys, initially wary of their unusual companion, began to recognize her contributions and appreciate her quiet strength. She learned their names, asked about their families, and listened to their stories around the evening campfire with genuine interest. In return, she shared tales of Apache life and customs that fascinated men who had known Indians only as distant threats. Cookie Williams became perhaps her strongest advocate after she showed him several desert plants that could be used to treat everything from saddle sores to stomach ailments. "Tom," he told Thomas one evening as they watched Ayana tend to young Jake Morrison's infected ropeburn, "that woman knows more about healing than most doctors I've met." We're lucky to have her. The transformation was not without its challenges. They encountered other travelers on the trail, army patrols, merchant caravans, and other cattle drives, and reactions to Ayana's presence ranged from curious to hostile. Thomas found himself forced to defend his decision repeatedly, sometimes with words and occasionally with the implied threat of violence. The most serious incident occurred when they crossed paths with a cavalry patrol commanded by Lieutenant James Morrison, a young officer fresh from West Point who viewed the world through the rigid lens of military regulation. Morrison took one look at Ayana and immediately assumed she was a prisoner or some kind of scout working for the army. "Mr. McKenna," the lieutenant said, his tone revealing his northeastern education and his inexperience with frontier realities. "I must ask what you're doing with this Apache woman. Are you aware that there are active hostilities in this region?" Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He had dealt with young officers like Morrison before, men who knew everything about military theory and nothing about the practical realities of life in Apache country. "Lieutenant, this is my wife, Ayana McKenna. We're traveling to Lordsburg with a cattle drive, and I'd appreciate it if you'd treat her with the respect due to a married woman." Morrison's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Your wife, Mr. McKenna? Surely you realize the complications that such an arrangement might create." "There are standing orders regarding the treatment of hostile Indians. She's not hostile, and she's not just any Indian," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the edge of warning that his crew knew meant he was approaching the limits of his patience. "She's my wife, traveling under my protection, and if you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me personally." The confrontation might have escalated if Ayana hadn't stepped forward and addressed the lieutenant directly. "Officer, my husband speaks truly. I am Ayana McKenna, and I travel with these men because they have shown me kindness and protection. I mean no harm to anyone, and I ask only to be allowed to continue our journey in peace." Her dignified bearing and educated speech clearly surprised Morrison, who had probably never encountered an Apache woman who could speak English with such eloquence. After a moment's hesitation, he touched his hat brim in a grudging gesture of respect. "Very well, Mr. Devhay McKenna, but I must warn you that not everyone you encounter will be as understanding as I am trying to be." The lieutenant's words proved prophetic. As they drew closer to Lordsburg and civilization, the challenges increased. Townfolk who had never seen an Apache except in the context of raids and warfare found it difficult to accept Ayana's presence. Hotel keepers refused them rooms, and shopkeepers served them reluctantly when they stopped for supplies. Through it all, Ayana maintained the same quiet dignity that had first impressed Thomas. She endured the stares and whispers without complaint, but Thomas could see the toll it was taking on her. The woman who had faced down a war party without flinching seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of constant suspicion and prejudice. It was during a supply stop in the small town of Silver Creek that Thomas's feelings about their relationship crystallized into something he hadn't expected. They had just been refused service at the town's only restaurant when a drunk cowboy stumbled out of the saloon and spotted Ayana. "Well, looky here," the man slurred, swaying on unsteady legs. "Got ourselves a genuine Apache squaw right here in town. What's the matter, boys?" Nobody told her this was white folks' territory. Thomas stepped between the drunk and Ayana, his hand moving instinctively to his gun belt. "Mister, I suggest you move along before you say something you'll regret." The drunk's companions, equally intoxicated, gathered around with the peculiar courage that whiskey provided. You defending this redskin cowboy? Maybe you like him dark and savage? Thomas felt something snap inside him. For weeks he had watched Ayanna endure insults and rejection with grace and dignity. He had seen her contribute her skills and knowledge to help his crew, only to be treated like a threat or curiosity by people who knew nothing about her character. The frustration and anger he had been suppressing finally found their target. "Her name is Mrs. McKenna," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly calm that preceded violence. "She's my wife, and if you say one more word about her, I'm going to teach you some manners the hard way." The confrontation ended when Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived and persuaded the drunks to move along, but the incident had a profound effect on Thomas. As he stood there, ready to fight for Ayanna's honor, he realized that his feelings for her had evolved far beyond duty or obligation. Somewhere along the dusty miles between the massacre site and Silver Creek, he had fallen in love with his Apache wife. That evening, as they camped outside town under the stars, Thomas found himself alone with Ayanna for the first time since their encounter with the war party. The crew had tactfully found other places to be, leaving husband and wife to talk privately by the dying campfire. "You did not have to defend me today," Ayanna said quietly. "I am used to such words from frightened people." Thomas turned to look at her, seeing her profile silhouetted against the firelight. "Maybe I didn't have to," he admitted. "But I wanted to. Nobody should have to listen to that kind of ignorance, especially not someone who's shown nothing but courage and kindness." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "When this journey ends, when we reach the railroad in Lordsburg, our agreement ends also. You will have kept your promise to Samuel, and I will be safe to make my own way." The statement hit Thomas with unexpected force. In all the challenges and complications of the past weeks, he had somehow lost sight of the fact that their marriage was supposed to be temporary. The realization that he might soon lose Ayanna created a hollow feeling in his chest that he hadn't anticipated. "Is that what you want?" he asked carefully. "To end our arrangement when we reach Lordsburg?" Ayanna turned to face him fully, and in the firelight Thomas could see emotions playing across her features that she usually kept carefully controlled. "What I want and what is wise may be different things. You are good man Thomas McKenna, but you have life to live. I am Apache woman in white man's world. I bring complications, danger, judgment from your people." Thomas reached over and took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of her strength and resilience. "Ayanna, I want you to know something. What started as duty has become something else entirely. I meant what I said today when I called you Mrs. McKenna. I'd like it to be true, not just for protection, but because I've come to care for you more than I ever expected to care for anyone." The admission hung in the air between them, and Thomas found himself holding his breath as he waited for her response. Finally, Ayanna spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have come to care for you also, Thomas. But caring and wisdom do not always walk the same path." Thomas understood her hesitation. Their marriage had been born out of necessity and Apache custom, not romance. Now they were facing the question of whether it could become something more lasting and meaningful. The obstacles were real: cultural differences, societal prejudice, and the practical challenges of building a life together in a world that would never fully accept their union. The next morning brought unexpected news that would change everything. A messenger rode into their camp carrying word that the railroad had extended its line farther west, and the new railhead was in the town of Deming, still several days' ride from Lordsburg. More importantly, the message indicated that there were buyers in Deming who were paying premium prices for cattle, better than what they could expect in Lordsburg. Thomas called his crew together to discuss the change in plans. The practical benefits were obvious. They could sell the cattle for more money and complete the drive sooner. But Thomas had another reason for wanting to continue to Deming. The town was newer, less established, and might be more accepting of his unconventional marriage. "What do you boys think?" Thomas asked his crew. "It means a few more days on the trail, but better money when we sell." Cookie Williams spoke for all of them. "Tom, we followed you this far, and we ain't about to quit now. Besides, I hear Deming's got a real restaurant, not just saloons and boarding houses." The decision made, they resumed their journey with renewed purpose. The landscape began to change as they moved higher into the mountains, and Ayanna's knowledge of the terrain became even more valuable. She guided them through passes that cut days off their travel time and warned them away from areas where recent rock slides had made the trail dangerous. It was during this final leg of the journey that Thomas and Ayana had their most honest conversation about their future. They were riding slightly ahead of the herd, scouting the trail, when Ayana suddenly stopped her horse and dismounted near a small spring hidden among the rocks. "This place is sacred to my people," she said as Thomas joined her beside the clear water. "It is a place where Apache women come to seek guidance when facing important decisions." Thomas understood that she was telling him something significant. He dismounted and sat beside her on a flat rock, waiting for her to speak her mind. "I have been thinking about what you said by the campfire," Ayana began. "About our marriage becoming real marriage, not just protection. I want to say yes, Thomas. My heart wants to say yes, but I am afraid." "Afraid of what?" Ayana picked up a small stone and tossed it into the spring, watching the ripples spread across the surface. "I am afraid that love is not enough. I am afraid that world will never let us have peace. I am afraid that someday you will regret choosing Apache woman over easy life with white woman who fits into your world." Thomas reached over and took her hands in his. "Ayana, I've spent my whole adult life on cattle trails, moving from place to place, never putting down roots because I never found anything worth staying for. You're the first person who's ever made me want to build something permanent, something lasting. But the difficulties will be real," Thomas interrupted. "I'm not pretending they won't be, but I've found that the best things in life are usually the hardest to achieve. If it was easy, it probably wouldn't be worth doing." Ayana studied his face intently, as if trying to read his soul. "You are certain you would choose life with Apache woman over simple life of cattleman?" Thomas thought about everything they had shared, the dangers they had faced together, the quiet conversations around evening campfires, the way she had fit seamlessly into his crew's rough fellowship, and the growing certainty in his heart that she was the partner he had never known he was looking for. "Uncertain," he said simply. "The question is whether you're willing to take that chance with me." Ayana was quiet for a long time, staring into the sacred spring as if seeking wisdom from its depths. When she finally spoke, her voice was strong and clear. "Yes, Thomas McKenna, I will take that chance. I will be your wife in all ways if you will have me." They were married again that evening, this time according to Thomas's customs, with Cookie Williams reading from his battered Bible while the crew stood witness under the desert stars. It was a simple ceremony, but it felt more real and meaningful than many elaborate weddings Thomas had attended in fancy churches. When they finally reached Deming 3 days later, they found a town that was indeed more accepting of diversity than the older settlements they had passed through. The cattle sold for even more than anticipated, and Thomas found himself financially secure for the first time in his adult life. More importantly, he found an opportunity that seemed almost too good to be true. A local banker named Harrison Wilcox was looking for a partner to establish a ranch in the valley north of town. Wilcox had the capital and business connections. He needed someone with practical experience in cattle ranching and knowledge of the local conditions. "McKenna," Wilcox said as they concluded their business, "I've heard about your reputation as a cattleman, and I've seen how you handle yourself and your crew. I'd be interested in discussing a partnership if you're looking for an opportunity to settle down." Thomas glanced at Ayana, who was waiting patiently nearby. She nodded almost imperceptibly, and he knew she understood what this opportunity could mean for both of them. "Mr. Wilcox," Thomas replied, "I think I might be very interested in discussing that partnership, but I should mention that my wife is Apache, and if that's going to be a problem for you or your business associates, we should settle that question right now." Wilcox looked at Ayana appraisingly, but without the hostility or suspicion they had encountered elsewhere. "Mr. McKenna, I've been in business long enough to know that character matters more than ancestry. If your wife is good enough for you, she's good enough for me." The partnership was formalized within a week, and Thomas found himself the co-owner of a ranch in the beautiful valley that would become their home. The crew was offered jobs on the new ranch, and to a man they accepted. They had become more than just cowboys working together. They had become a family forged by shared challenges and mutual respect. As Thomas and Ayana stood on the porch of their new house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas reflected on the amazing journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a simple act of kindness to a stranded trader, continued with an Apache woman's desperate claim of marriage, and culminated in a love story that neither of them could have imagined. "Do you ever regret it?" Ayana asked quietly, as if reading his thoughts, choosing this complicated path instead of simple life. Thomas put his arm around his wife and pulled her closer. "Never," he said firmly. Sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected directions. Ayana smiled and leaned against his shoulder. Manuel would be pleased, I think. His last wish brought together two people who needed each other but did not know it. In the distance, they could hear Cookie calling the crew to supper and the sound of cattle settling down for the night. It was the sound of home, of belonging, of a life built on understanding and respect rather than just tradition and convenience. Thomas McKenna had started that cattle drive as a bachelor cowboy with no plans beyond delivering his herd and collecting his pay. He was ending it as a married man, a ranch owner, and a bridge between two cultures that had been at war for too long. Sometimes, he reflected, the best adventures were the ones you never saw coming. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Thomas and Ayana went inside to join their extended family for the evening meal. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings and the assurance that love, courage, and understanding could overcome even the most formidable obstacles. The cowboys' unexpected answer to an Apache woman's claim had turned out to be the beginning of something neither of them had dared to dream possible, a true partnership built on respect, strengthened by adversity, and blessed with the rare gift of genuine love. In a land where differences too often led to conflict, they had found a way to create harmony. Their story would be told around campfires and in ranch houses for generations to come, a testament to the power of keeping one's word and opening one's heart to unexpected possibilities. Years later, when people asked Thomas about the secret to their successful marriage, he would always give the same answer. Sometimes the best thing you can do is say yes when someone asks for your help, even when you don't know where it might lead. Ayana claimed me as her husband to save her life, but in the end, she saved mine too.